All right. Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending our third webinar in our series on the U.S. election webinars. My name is Thomas Gould. I'm the Communications Manager for the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns. Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns works on behalf of the Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers, the Maryknoll Sisters, and the Maryknoll Lay Missioners to elevate the insights of lived experiences of missioners to the seats of power where change can be made. Throughout the month of October, we've been covering topics germane to the election that are significant to the Maryknoll family. Recordings of our previous webinars, including Peace, War, and Human Rights, and Faithful Stewardship of Creation, are available on our website now and on our YouTube page. We're currently live streaming to our YouTube page right now. Our last webinar in the series is Faith-Based Migrant Justice, and it will be held 1 week from today. And today's webinar is titled Debt Relief in a Jubilee Year with Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns Director, Susan Gunn. Susan Gunn joined the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns 12 years ago, and she has served as the director since 2018. She has a master's degree in International Development Management from American University. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm so happy to be here with you. This topic that we have today about debt relief in a Jubilee year is very near and dear to my heart. I just returned from a week in Rome planning meetings at Caritas International in Vatican City to prepare for the Jubilee year, which Pope Francis will start us off on Christmas Eve this year. So a big deal for 2025, and we will have an election before then with a new president and new Congress and new things in our states. So hopefully we can get the two things to work well together and make great contributions to the world. So I'd like to go ahead and share my screen because I prepared some slides to help explain the topic. Okay, I hope you all can see that. So we've come here today to talk about debt relief, the global debt crisis. But first, I want to ask, have you heard of the global climate crisis? Because chances are you have. So this map is the daily fire weather forecast by NASA for the world one day this past summer. So you can see where the world is burning due to the rising global temperatures and extreme weather events. So this is something we're all familiar with. But have you heard of the global debt crisis? So the global debt crisis is a growing burden of debt that threatens a significant number of lower income countries. Those here on the map that you see that are in the dark red are very critically impacted with debt, and then the lighter the color, the less critical. So ultimately, this will impact not only the lower income countries, but all of global prosperity. So the world's debt has increased dramatically in recent years, and it's now at a record high. And the global public debt reached a record of $97 trillion in 2023. Now, I want to pause and let you stare at this map for a minute and tell you that not all debt is bad. Public debt is vital for development. Governments use it to finance their expenditures, to protect and invest in their people, and to build their way to a better future. However, if it's too much, if it's a heavy burden, then it's not something that we can keep up with in our economies. So this is what's happening today across the developing world. Let's look at some of the numbers that come out of that map I just had. First, in 130 of the 152 countries surveyed in the global south for that map, the debt situation is at least slightly critical, which was the light orange color, or worse. In 24 of these countries, the situation is very critical, and those were in red on the map. And a record 54 countries spent heavily on interest, and they're almost all in Africa. And overall, 55% of the countries surveyed for the map are critically or very critically indebted. And this is in contrast to only 37% before the COVID pandemic. And more than 1 billion US dollars a day is needed for debt service payments. That's a day. And according to the UN report entitled A World of Debt, more than 3.3 billion people, that's almost half of the world's population, live in countries that spend more on debt service than they do on education or healthcare. And the UN Secretary General called this downward spiral a systemic failure of the global community. It's important to have a spotlight on Africa when we're talking about debt. The debt situation in sub-Saharan Africa is particularly problematic. The Global Sovereign Debt Monitor rated the debt situation as very critical for 11 countries and critical for 22 countries on the African continent. And this means that a total of 67% of sub-Saharan African countries belong to the group of critically or very critically indebted countries. And one of the reasons for this is that in 2022, the economy in sub-Saharan Africa grew much more slowly than other regions of the global south. And although public debt is growing in all the regions, only in Africa is it growing faster than GDP. The majority of African countries spend more in 2023 repaying debts than they did on healthcare or education, and sometimes, in some cases, on both of those combined. In South Sudan, where millions are facing hunger, more than 10 times more is spent on external debt than on healthcare. In Malawi, where just 15% of children finish secondary school, twice as much is spent on debt than education. And in Kenya, we saw deadly protests this past summer after the government attempted to raise taxes to mitigate a debt crisis that saw interest payments swell to absorb almost 60% of total government revenues. Putting the spotlight on Latin America and the Caribbean, we see the debt situation has been persistently problematic for many years. The number of countries in which the situation has worsened significantly since 2019 is roughly equal to the number of countries in which the situation has remained the same. Countries that are heavily dependent on selling commodities experience greater volatility in their economic activity and exports, and this limits their attempts to maintain lower levels of sustainable debt. Conversely, nations with a more diversified economic structure are better positioned to manage a higher level of debt relative to their GDP. The Inter-American Development Bank has established a maximum average sustainable debt level for Latin America and the Caribbean at 80.5% of GDP, while recommending maintaining a prudent debt level between 55 and 44% of GDP. Now, several countries in the region, such as Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, and El Salvador, currently stand above the sustainable debt limit. There's almost no prospect of their debt burdens being decreased enough to reverse this trend. And this implies that these countries have little fiscal space to maneuver and urgently need to implement further fiscal reforms in order to attain long-term economic stability and growth. On the other hand, robust performance in countries such as Guatemala, Peru, Chile, Paraguay, Nicaragua, Honduras have maintained and they sustain a public debt level below prudent levels. But you have to ask the question, are any of them providing for their people and addressing climate change? Or are they just taking care of their debt? Now we're going to put the spotlight on South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. The high level of debt is new for this part of the world. Compared to 2019, the situation has deteriorated significantly in over 60% of the countries surveyed. This includes Bhutan, Laos, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan, whose debt situation is rated as very critical in the Global Sovereign Debt Monitor. So we have to ask, how did we get here? A quarter of a century ago, the Jubilee 2000 campaign led to the cancellation of more than $100 billion in debt owed by 35 of the world's poorest countries. And 25 years later, the global public debt keeps rising, forcing many lower income countries to spend more on debt payments than what they invest on responding to climate, health, and education priorities. Even with investments in development made by funds released through the Jubilee 2000 campaign, we know schools were built, medicines were delivered. Ultimately, lower income countries' economic vulnerability has yet to be addressed. So let's take a look at that. Even with investments in development made by funds released through the Jubilee 2000 campaign, we see economic vulnerabilities continue, and one of the key reasons is dependence on commodities. We're talking about fossil fuels, metals, cash crops. Depending on commodities for income that vary widely in price and often provide few jobs, leaves countries vulnerable to major shifts in their economies. This is the case for Malawi. You see here a photo of men bundling tobacco leaves for drying for export in Malawi. Malawi's main export is tobacco, and it accounts for 55% of their total exports. Another factor fueling the current debt crisis is what happened after the 2008 financial crisis, when interest rates in the US and the UK were kept low to stimulate growth. This led to lenders looking to increase lending to lower income countries where they could charge higher rates and make more profits. The World Bank defines 2010 as the beginning of the current wave of the debt crisis. And the rise in global interest rates since the year 2022 further strained public budgets in developing countries, already grappling with the pandemic recovery and climate shocks and rising food and energy prices due to the war in Ukraine. And according to the UN report entitled A World of Debt, in the developing world, home to 3.3 billion people, 1 out of every 3 countries spends more on interest payments than they do on health, education, and climate action. So let's take a look at the impacts on women and girls. The African Forum and Network on Debt and Development has called the debt crisis a development crisis. And unless the global financial architecture is fixed, the impacts are going to hit vulnerable people the hardest. And that always begins with women and girls. In the debt crisis, women and girls are hit triply, 3 times over, losing access to social benefits, losing public service jobs, often in healthcare and education, like this school teacher here. And women and girls take on the burden of unpaid care after public services fail or when climate-induced disasters hit. We also have impacts on climate action. The vast majority, you can see here a list of 1 through 20 countries most vulnerable to the climate crisis are either in debt distress or at significant risk of debt distress. Research by the organization ActionAid found that 38 out of 63 most climate vulnerable countries are already spending so much on debt service that they're likely to be cutting spending on public services, making it impossible to invest in a just transition. So it's time to recognize the vicious cycle between the debt and the climate crisis. Countries in debt are forced to pursue extractive economic policies that will accelerate the climate crisis, and the consequences of debt make it harder to finance adaptation and a just transition. In turn, climate-induced disasters increase their indebtedness, and loan-based climate finance deepens the crisis. And so the cycle continues. So what does our faith teach us how to respond in this moment of a global debt crisis? Pope Francis tells us that hope does not disappoint. This was his message when he announced that 2025 will be a Jubilee year in the Catholic Church, a year of forgiveness, reconciliation, and hope that occurs every 25 years. And he said every effort should be made to enable the people of God to participate fully in proclaiming the hope in God's grace and the signs that attest to its efficacy. So I have a confession to make. This is not my first Jubilee. I'm old enough to have taken part in the Jubilee 2000 campaign in the 1990s, and maybe you did too. It's nothing to be ashamed of. In this case, age is an asset because the Jubilee 2000 campaign was an awesome experience, and it will help us this time. We were lucky to have been part of it. I can say that the personal prayer and the fasting that I did as part of the Jubilee 2000 campaign had a huge influence on me as a young adult. It turned me on to building a life that was more simple, more contemplative, and more connected. And it cultivated in me a deep conviction that it is possible to start over, that another world is possible, and that economic justice is possible. Because the Old Testament told us that it had been done before many times over, and that there are people around the world today who believe in new beginnings, who want to start anew now, today. So the Jubilee idea in the Bible is perhaps the greatest model in human history of restorative justice. It's God's call to us over and over again to create structures of justice that will allow people to start anew. The vision of Jubilee is most fully explained in the book of Leviticus, and there we learn that the Jubilee was a time to let the land rest and allow whatever it naturally produced to be shared by all, landowner and slave alike. And it was a time to set slaves free and to return to its original owner any land that had been sold. The Jubilee was also a time to cancel debts. Jubilee is all about debt cancellation, restoring community, and freedom from debt bondage. The Jubilee year was meant to restore equality among all the children of Israel, offering new possibilities to families which had lost their property or even their personal freedom. And on the other hand, the Jubilee year was a reminder to the rich that a time will come when the Israelite slaves would once again become their equals and would be able to reclaim their rights. At the times prescribed by law, a Jubilee year had to be proclaimed to assist those in need. And as Christians, we interpret this tradition in light of Jesus' teaching. When Jesus announced his public ministry, he quoted the passage from Isaiah 61 that refers to the Jubilee tradition. He said he had come to, quote, bring glad tidings to the poor, to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free. And he added, today this scripture passage is fulfilled in your hearing. So the tradition of Jubilee then is deeply related to sharing the good news and building the beloved community of God on earth by establishing God's righteousness. It's an important part of the Jubilee tradition to cancel debts, giving those who have become overwhelmed by unpayable debts a chance to start over. At its core, the Jubilee vision about debt cancellation includes 5 principles of Catholic social teaching: upholding life and dignity of the human person. This principle of upholding the dignity of the human person is violated when the debt crisis contributes to suffering among the world's poor. It's also about care for the common good. By creating suffering or draining resources from such basic needs as healthcare and education, the debt crisis violates the common good. Next, the Jubilee upholds the Catholic social teaching of solidarity. And in the case of international debt, the principle of solidarity requires that we act to relieve the crisis and its dire consequences on the world's poorest people, who are our brothers and sisters. The Jubilee also demonstrates preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, because the sad truth of the debt crisis is that it's often the weakest members of society, the young who need education, the ill who need health care, the poor who need jobs, who through no fault of their own end up paying the greatest price for the debt. And finally, the Jubilee upholds care for creation. The debt crisis threatens the health of the environment, pressuring indebted countries to misuse the environment in order to raise money to repay debts. And the Jubilee has a thing or two to say about justice. Catholic social teaching moves us to take action on debt because it is just. There are three classic principles of justice: commutative justice, distributive justice, and social justice. And the debt crisis violates all three forms of justice. Commutative justice calls for fundamental fairness in all agreements and exchanges between parties. Distributive justice requires the allocation of income, wealth, and power in society be evaluated in light of its effect on people whose basic needs are unmet. And social justice implies that people have an obligation to be active and productive participants in the life of society, and that society has a duty to enable them to participate. So, in the Catholic view, the debt crisis choking too many countries today violates all three forms of justice. Now, I want to say, while commutative justice leads to the moral presumption that all debts must be paid, this concept must be understood within the broader context of distributive and social justice. Distributive justice requires that judgments about the fairness of an international loan agreement must take into account its impact on those who are poor. And in many cases, international debts have a devastating impact on the poor and other vulnerable members of society. Social justice requires that political, economic, and social institutions promote participation and human development. And in many cases, the international loan agreements end up undermining institutions by draining the funds that support them and then forcing individuals to focus on just surviving rather than participating in and contributing to society. In the case of international debt, then, justice involves co-responsibility on the part of debtors and creditors who must seek to relieve the suffering caused by debt while promoting sound political, social, and economic policies. These principles and themes from Catholic social teaching make a compelling case for debt relief for the world's poorest countries. It was true in Jubilee 2000, and it's true in Jubilee 2025. So as you go to the polls this November to cast your vote for leaders of the United States, I ask you to keep in mind that Pope Francis will officially launch the Jubilee year a few weeks after Election Day on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 2024, when he opens the Holy Door at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The Jubilee year is a special opportunity to change lives and transform relationships. So I ask you to consider what you can do to share a message of hope, to be hope in our broken world during the Jubilee year. Pope Francis and the Jubilee vision are calling us to end unjust debt and restore and renew hope. And so I invite you to join us in working for this transformation in 2025 and start thinking about it and how it will impact your elected leaders that you're going to vote for just in 20 days from today. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for a very comprehensive and yet also sobering presentation. I was not aware just how dire the global debt crisis was. Now, I want to open this up to questions from participants. The way to ask a question is if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A. Feel free to type in questions into that box, and we'll answer them as they come up. I want to get us started with a couple questions that I have. Specifically, I think you mentioned a little bit the impact on women and girls, but what are some of the other human impacts that the debt burden has? Because I think we tend to look at the debt crisis as something that's just on paper, on an accounting sheet.
That's a great question, Thomas. I shared a lot of numbers and I appreciate that it can get just overwhelming and they're huge numbers. But they really do impact individual people's lives. I mentioned this past summer in Kenya, I don't know if you remember in the news that the president suggested he made a tax proposal that he wanted to tax the citizens of Kenya at a level that people found just unacceptable, particularly when they were already struggling so much, particularly young people, to find employment. And they were witnessing in many different places throughout their country corruption, rampant corruption, where government funds, public funds were siphoned off and roads were not built with funds and schools were not built. So it was quite obvious corruption was happening. And yet these young people were graduating with degrees and not able to find jobs. And the president wanted to tax them more in order to pay back debts. So unfortunately, it ended up becoming violent. The demonstrations that occurred in the capital city and then throughout the country of Kenya, but their message was heard and the tax proposal was ended. Kenya continues to have a debt burden that is really unsustainable. And that's why we need a cancellation of debt, a restructuring of the system that creates these debts so that countries can develop and grow. But really, I want to talk about something else besides Kenya's situation. Really, the top impact right now in the world from the debt burden is hunger. And I want to lift up two places. In Zambia, there's been a terrible drought, and that has threatened hunger for millions of people. In normal years, Zambia has a food surplus, and they export to their neighboring countries, Malawi, Zimbabwe, the DRC. But Zambia is also, like scores of other climate vulnerable countries, struggling under a mountain of debt. And it's been worsened by the high interest rates around the world that came because of the war in Ukraine. And so the Zambian government has gotten some help from the IMF to restructure its debt, and it's taken measures to stabilize the economy, but then the drought hit. And the government was in no position to respond to feeding desperate people as they were making these debt repayments. Similarly, in Malawi, they had flooding due to El Nino weather events and then devastating drought. And roughly 2 out of 5 people in Malawi, and this is a country of about 20 million people, are now facing acute hunger by the end of this year. A particular risk is the progress that Malawi has made in improving its maternal and infant nutrition. And that would be during the first 1,000 days of life for a baby. So this is just taking the debt crisis and putting it in real life and or death terms. So that I want to lift up those who are, particularly in the African countries, who are trying to feed their families and take care of their health under this debt burden.
Wonderful answer. I think you also mentioned something that you sort of addressed in the presentation, that there's an outsized set of debt by these countries, and they've grown significantly just in the past 10 years. What really what were some of the causes of that?
So it's really two things. And first of all, there have just been a lot of shocks that have happened. And I've mentioned climate, right? So increasing extreme weather events due to climate change. But then also just the global economy was at its slowest 5-year growth period since the 1990s. And then we had the COVID pandemic shocks and the war in Ukraine that made supply chain shocks. So this slammed the brakes on economic growth and really trapped countries into just surviving in the moment. This caused a global cost of living increase and then inflation. But even without all of these external shocks, the global financial architecture is truly broken. Instead of a safety net, I would describe that developing countries are facing an outdated and a dysfunctional and an unjust global economic system. The institutions of the Bretton Woods system, I'm talking about the World Bank and the IMF, they were designed for a world of our grandparents, not the world today, let alone the world for our future grandchildren. Over 3/4 of today's countries were not present at the creation of the World Bank or the IMF. And in many cases, they were colonies under colonial rule. So these financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, were designed by the richest developed countries, and they remain dominated by them. You may have just read in the news about the three economists who won the Nobel Prize. And I was just reading, I think, in the New York Times yesterday about what they are most famous for. And they're most famous for research demonstrating the importance of societal institutions for a country's prosperity. Societies with a poor rule of law or institutions that exploit the population don't generate growth or change for the better. So countries that were once colonies have become trapped in a situation with extractive institutions and low economic growth. And so this is the legacy of colonialism, and we're seeing it play out in the global debt crisis.
It sounds like a real vicious cycle. One last prepared question before I open it up to the audience. Would it be better then to say that the US should respond, or the UN or whatever body it is, with more direct aid in the form of grants? Or is there some other kind of action or intervention we should be looking at?
The short answer is yes. Yes to grants, grants over loans. Grants from an individual country or from an international institution like the World Bank's International Development Association, that makes up one of the approaches to responding to the debt crisis. But for the first time in 20 years, there are more loans than grants being offered. So we need wealthy nations like the United States to make contributions to that International Development Association. And then that association awards the grants as well as low interest loans to countries.
Well, we've got a lot of questions, so I'm going to open it up. Are there any substantive guidelines or guardrails that address appropriate debt from the country or public point of view? What about accounting and monitoring of spending?
Oh, absolutely. When countries enter into these processes and mechanisms to sometimes it's called restructuring the debt, and various mechanisms that the World Bank has. It does set off a whole system of monitoring and evaluation, and they want to be a part of the global system to access finance. So I can say that we have found that the relief of being free of such a heavy debt burden does make it worthwhile to participate in those structures.
Could you say something about who controls the debt and what or who can put pressure on those who are in control?
I wonder if the person asking the question is aware that private creditors are a big problem this go around. So the previous Jubilee 2000 campaign, we really just were trying to get politicians of the G7, to agree to cancel debt. This go around, so much of the debt is controlled by private creditors, and when I say that, I mean, hedge funds. And for the United States, many of these hedge funds sit in the state of New York, and they're licensed to operate through the state of New York. So regulating them, getting them, forcing them to participate in debt reduction schemes requires legislation from the state of New York. Uh, and this is quite different from the first go around and a greater challenge. They have a similar situation in the UK where it's private creditors as well, but they need the UK Parliament to pass legislation. So that's where it sits for a big chunk of the debt.
That's a really good point, and it reminds me of the fact that there are down ballot important races too. That even an election in New York, your state legislator could have a global impact, especially for all of those of us who vote in New York.
Yeah.
I have another question here. I was told that the Jubilee year is the whole 12 months, with each month focusing on a different topic or theme or issue. One of the months will be about social justice. I don't know when that is, or when the debt forgiveness campaign will be emphasized. So, kind of a logistical question. Will this be an issue during the course of the full year, or will we be having a specific focus on this at a specific time?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, and we can share when we send an email to everyone with resources, the recording of this, we can share the calendar for the Jubilee year. And that's correct. There is a calendar for different groups to make pilgrimage to come to Rome. And Rome is quite busy with construction right now, trying to clean themselves up for all their visitors in 2025. But this campaign will last not only the entire calendar year, I'm sure it's going to go on into 2026 and even 2027. But we need to get commitments from those that pull the levers at the World Bank and the IMF in 2025 and get the ball rolling. We're looking at key events. The UN is going to have a conference in Spain in, I believe, is it the end of June or July, the Financing for Development Conference. And that is where we and our partners, other Catholic organizations we work with and other faith-based organizations, want to bring the message, the vision of Jubilee debt cancellation to the UN Financing for Development Conference in Spain next summer, because we want to ask that the UN agrees to establish a mechanism for addressing a just reworking and restructuring of debt, and that they would then have influence towards the World Bank and the IMF. So that's a key moment. Also, before then, during Lent, the debt relief and debt cancellation is going to be a major theme throughout the Catholic Church for the Lenten season, which I believe Ash Wednesday is in March this year. So starting in March through April. So those two times will be very busy times for this campaign.
Um, so, another question here. So, why is it that the United States has so much debt and does not seem to have an issue with that, that they manage just fine?
Yeah. Well, you may have heard that we have a diversified economy. right? We're not just selling dried tobacco from Malawi, right? We have so many different types of industries and products. So a highly diversified economy and a highly wealthy economy. We have the Fed that can really pull levers and orchestrate the US dollar so that it's working at its best for the United States. And then all the other countries that depend on US dollar have to react and respond to that. So we have the power, we have the resources, we have the diversified economy, and we're a huge country itself. Even just the state of California has an economy that's larger than some countries. So quite a powerhouse.
And another question, uh, will debt relief potentially make it harder for developing nations to borrow in the future?
Well, I'd say the short answer to that is no if we do it right. What I'm trying to describe is a transformation of an unjust economic system. And when I talked about the World Bank and the IMF being established years ago, it was a different world, and so many of these lower income countries were actually colonies at that moment. We need a new economic system that values development and values addressing the climate crisis, that values people and the planet. God did not create us to be without. We were created with abundance and to have life of abundance. And we're not bereft. We have enough to share if we can do it justly.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Susan, for answering all of those very difficult questions and laying out a very comprehensive view of a very sober topic. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. This was our third webinar in this series, and we have one more. To all of you who asked questions, thank you for those. And just to let you all know, the previous recordings to all of the other webinars are posted online. They're on our website. They're also on our YouTube page. And the next webinar, which will be on faith-based migrant justice, will be 1 week from now. And that will also be live streamed and available on our website when that is done. A couple other resources for you all. We've prepared a handy little 2-pager with a lot of the information covered in this webinar. It mentions all of the statistics and figures and names specific ways that you can be involved. We also invite you to sign up to our email lists and to our social media. We have Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and to look out for further activities and for advocacy for social justice in the future. So I hope we will see you all in 1 week.
Thank you, Thomas.